It was 10:07 p.m., and the CBD office building was still glowing from top to bottom. The entire high-rise looked like a sleepless steel carcass, its glass facade reflecting the city's neon lights, while the interior remained completely dead and silent. The daytime chaos, the arguments, the flattery, the office politics had entirely faded away. The only sound left was the low hum of the central AC, keeping company with floor after floor of empty cubicles. The security guard had made his third patrol round 10 minutes prior, shining a flashlight through the glass partition of the marketing department, glanced at Ben alone at his desk, shrugged, and continued his route without a second thought. Night shift cleaners wouldn't arrive until midnight, leaving the 18th floor wrapped in a hollow, isolated quiet. In the vast, open-plan layout of the marketing department, only a single desk lamp was on. Ben sat by the window, his back perfectly straight. The blue glare of his computer screen washed over his face, masking his exhaustion and leaving only a look of detached composure. He'd brought a plain plastic water bottle from the convenience store downstairs, sitting untouched at the edge of the desk. He hadn't taken a sip in over 2 hours, fully absorbed in the rows of data laid out before him. There were no snacks on his desk, no coffee mugs, no flashy trinkets, just a neat stack of physical manila folders, their side tabs labeled with crisp project dates and names. Half of the folders were marked Official Archive Submission, meant to be handed over to Greg the next morning. Tidy, surface-level paperwork with no red flags to a casual auditor. The other half, locked inside a password-protected encrypted hard drive, tucked into his desk drawer, held a separate set of records he'd spent 6 months compiling in secret. His screen was packed with ledgers, scanned contracts, expense reports, and reimbursement breakdowns. These dense rows of data looked chaotic to the untrained eye, but Ben had woven them all together with a flawless logical thread. To anyone walking by, he just looked like another miserable junior employee forced to work late to clean up his superior's leftover workload. Nobody knew that this young man, sitting alone in the dead of night, was quietly dismantling a senior executive's 5-year power base. The sudden crackdown on him 6 months ago was practically common knowledge around the office. Everyone assumed that Ben, once a rising star in project management, was completely done for. Ben looked at the reimbursement forms for the River City Resort project on his screen, his fingers pausing for a split second. 6 months ago, this was the core account he had pulled all-nighters for, nearly running himself ragged to lock down. Yet, on the very eve of the contract signing, Greg, the marketing VP, pulled the rug out from under him with a single transfer order. Ben, this project involves too many high-level variables. You're just too green to handle it, Greg had told him in front of the entire department, his tone dripping with fake empathy. Let Dave take the lead, and you can support him. Dave was Greg's college roommate, a man with zero client negotiation experience, who spent most workdays scrolling sports news and playing golf after lunch. The whole team watched the exchange in silence, nobody daring to interject. Ben had tried to speak up, only to be cut off with a sharp wave of Greg's hand. What followed was a textbook corporate execution. His credit was stolen, his title was downgraded, and his bonuses were slashed. He went from running core projects to being a glorified admin, relegated to sorting files and archiving documents. His boss looked down on him, and his coworkers froze him out. Just last month, a new hire who had been with the company for less than 90 days actually had the nerve to dump a stack of misprinted papers on his desk before a meeting. "Hey Ben, do me a favor and shred these real quick. I'm in a rush." Ben didn't say a word. He just took the papers and fed them into the shredder. The gossip in the break room, the whispers around the cubicles, the deliberate snubs in meetings, this had been his daily life for the past 6 months. Last week, the team held a casual lunch gathering down the street. Every single staff member invited except him. He'd passed the restaurant window on his way to grab dinner and seen them laughing together, glasses raised, while he walked on without slowing his pace. Greg had personally dragged him into the mud, and once he was sure Ben couldn't fight back, he completely let his guard down. In Greg's eyes, Ben was just an idealistic, naive kid who didn't know how to play the game. He thought Ben had challenged authority out of reckless pride and got exactly what he deserved. Now that the kid seemed broken, quiet, and compliant, Greg figured he posed absolutely no threat. As a result, Greg felt safe leaving 5 years' worth of historical contracts and shady financial records locked in the archive room. And the key? He handed it right to Ben, the designated admin grunt. He even joked in front of the whole team, "No one's more trustworthy with filing than Ben. He's got nothing better to do anyway." The room laughed, and Ben only nodded faintly. But only Ben knew the truth. He wasn't broken, he was awake. When he was first framed, blacklisted, and stripped of everything, he had felt the same rage, resentment, and injustice. He had suffered through endless, sleepless nights. He tried to explain himself, taking his original proposals, client chat logs, and signed work deliverables to the HR director. He tried to blow the whistle, CCing the senior VP on internal emails with full evidence attached. But he quickly realized that in the corporate arena, the truth doesn't mean a thing. Leverage does. The HR director just gave him a polite runaround, repeatedly pushing his meetings back and claiming the schedule was full. The VP's assistant wouldn't even let him through the door, claiming the executive's calendar was booked for months. No one was going to stick their neck out for a disgraced junior employee and risk crossing Greg, who held the keys to the department and had deep roots across the company. Every grievance was quietly swept under the rug. Every explanation was labeled as insubordination or a bad attitude. One mid-level manager even pulled Ben aside privately to warn him, "Drop this, or your next transfer will be to the remote regional branch 3 hours outside the city." Smoking half a pack of cigarettes on the roof one evening, it finally clicked. The dumbest way to fight back in the office is to scream, complain, and lose your cool. Doing that just makes you look desperate and immature, and it proves every lie they made up about you. Real leverage is never loud. So he buried his emotions and accepted the unfair treatment without a word. When they demoted him, he did the grunt work flawlessly, showing up first every morning to organize files and wipe down desks. When they ignored him, he stayed out of the spotlight, even sitting in the furthest corner at company happy hours. When they mocked him, he just offered a faint smile. Once, Greg assigned him to sort thousands of old printed receipts by hand over a weekend. No overtime pay offered. Ben showed up Saturday morning at 8, finished the full stack by Sunday evening, and handed it over Monday without a single complaint. He turned himself into a ghost in the department, low profile, compliant, and completely harmless. And it was precisely this illusion of harmlessness that got him the key to the archive room, giving him the perfect vantage point. For the past 6 months, under the guise of organizing Greg's old files, he had manually copied every single contract, shell company transaction, and inflated vendor kickback that had passed through Greg's hands over the last 5 years. Whenever Greg left confidential paperwork scattered on his desk after leaving early for golf outings, Ben would stay late to scan every page before locking the documents back in the filing cabinet, erasing all traces of his access. Click. Down the hall, the quiet rattle of a janitor's cart broke the silence, then faded away. Ben didn't look up. His eyes were locked on the final row of the spreadsheet. It was a transaction from 2 years ago for the North Mountain Project, a $2 million line item listed as a consulting fee to a firm called Nexus Tech. The registered owner of Nexus Tech happened to be Greg's brother-in-law. Ben cross-referenced the company's business license information he'd retrieved through public industry registration channels. The firm had 0 office address, no full-time staff, and never released any service case studies. Yet it kept receiving multi-million-dollar annual contracts from the marketing division. The paperwork looked compliant on the surface, but underneath, it was pure embezzlement. The final piece of the puzzle was in place. As the night wore on, the city lights stretched out across the horizon. Ben clicked his mouse, packaging the 5 years of financial fraud, third-party audit trail, and bank records into a final, encrypted PDF. He double-checked every attachment, cross-verified timestamps, and added a labeled index page to organize all 127 pages of supporting evidence. In the recipient line of the email, he typed in the addresses for corporate compliance, the internal audit team, and the local. Grunt worked flawlessly, showing up first every morning to organize files and wipe down desks. When they ignored him, he stayed out of the spotlight, even sitting in the furthest corner at company happy hours. When they mocked him, he just offered a faint smile. Once, Greg assigned him to sort thousands of old printed receipts by hand over a weekend. No overtime pay offered. Ben showed up Saturday morning at 8, finished the full stack by Sunday evening, and handed it over Monday without a single complaint. He turned himself into a ghost in the department, low profile, compliant, and completely harmless. And it was precisely this illusion of harmlessness that got him the key to the archive room, giving him the perfect vantage point. For the past 6 months, under the guise of organizing Greg's old files, he had manually copied every single contract, shell company transaction, and inflated vendor kickback that had passed through Greg's hands over the last 5 years. Whenever Greg left confidential paperwork scattered on his desk after leaving early for golf outings, Ben would stay late to scan every page before locking the documents back in the filing cabinet, erasing all traces of his access. Click. Down the hall, the quiet rattle of a janitor's cart broke the silence, then faded away. Ben didn't look up. His eyes were locked on the final row of the spreadsheet. It was a transaction from 2 years ago for the North Mountain Project, a $2 million line item listed as a consulting fee to a firm called Nexus Tech. The registered owner of Nexus Tech happened to be Greg's brother-in-law. Ben cross-referenced the company's business license information he'd retrieved through public industry registration channels. The firm had 0 office address, no full-time staff, and never released any service case studies. Yet it kept receiving multi-million-dollar annual contracts from the marketing division. The paperwork looked compliant on the surface, but underneath it was pure embezzlement. The final piece of the puzzle was in place. As the night wore on, the city lights stretched out across the horizon. Ben clicked his mouse, packaging the 5 years of financial fraud, third-party audit trail, and bank records into a final encrypted PDF. He double-checked every attachment, cross-verified timestamps, and added a labeled index page to organize all 127 pages of supporting evidence. In the recipient line of the email, he typed in the addresses for corporate compliance, the internal audit team, and the local white-collar crime division. He set the email delivery delay to noon the next day, buying himself time to wrap up the official archive files without triggering immediate suspicion. He wasn't rushing, and he wasn't anxious. He knew that a real reckoning doesn't require panic. As long as you have airtight evidence and the rules on your side, time is always on your side. Ben turned off his desk lamp and pulled out the flash drive, making 2 separate encrypted backups and storing them in 2 different secure locations. One in his personal bag, another hidden inside a locked storage locker at the building lobby. The office plunged into darkness once more, but this time, the dark wasn't his prison. It was his territory. 8 months ago, the marketing department was a completely different story. At the time, the parent company's overall revenue had taken a massive hit due to a brutal industry downturn. The overseas supply chain had collapsed, and multiple major domestic projects were abruptly shelved halfway through execution. With the financial reports showing red for 2 consecutive quarters, the executives shouting during weekly meetings could be heard all the way down the hall. Panic ran rampant through the department. Every mid-level manager was scrambling to dodge risk and deflect blame. No one wanted to touch the new business development projects, which everyone viewed as guaranteed train wrecks. During a team meeting, Greg openly passed the project brief around the table, and every single subordinate made up an excuse to turn it down. It was Ben, with only 3 years at the company under his belt, who finally stepped up and signed his name on a project proposal everyone else was ignoring. He had no dedicated resources, no senior team to back him up, and even the initial seed funding from corporate had been chipped away by upper management bureaucracy until there was barely anything left. Relying entirely on the industry contacts and solid business acumen he had built up over 3 years, Ben mapped out the project framework from scratch on a whiteboard. With just 2 interns by his side, he started pitching clients door to door. The interns were inexperienced, prone to making basic format errors on proposals, so Ben stayed late every night to fix their work alongside his own core planning. Those 8 months were nothing short of a brutal grind. He practically lived at the office, his desk constantly littered with stomach meds and strong coffee, to land a major client in the East Coast region, one notorious for impossible entry barriers, where dozens of seasoned teams had already failed. He spent 2 weeks straight traveling across the country, locked in endless, exhausting negotiations, compromising where he had to, and fighting for every inch. He'd missed his younger sister's graduation ceremony to attend a critical client summit, only receiving a short apologetic text from her afterward. When his midnight proposals were picked apart by the client's managers, he would scrap everything and rewrite them overnight. At his lowest point, when the client even refused to see him, Ben waited in the coffee shop downstairs from their office for 12 straight hours. It wasn't until late that night that he finally won over their chief operating officer with a razor-sharp margin concession plan calculated down to the last 2 decimal places. The COO later admitted he'd never seen a junior account manager put in that level of consistent effort. In the end, against all odds, he locked down the account, bringing in a cool $30 million in cold hard cash for the company. That influx of capital instantly wiped out the department's long-standing deficit and single-handedly stabilized the company's plummeting revenue. The day the contract was signed, the entire department breathed a sigh of relief. Everyone knew exactly who deserved the credit. 90% of it belonged to Ben. The 2 interns he'd mentored came to his desk with handwritten thank you notes, telling him they'd learned more from this project than their entire university coursework. But the harshest reality of corporate life is that sweat is easily forgotten, credit is easily stolen, and the people at the bottom have no voice. The celebration gala 2 weeks later was a lavish affair. Corporate leadership turned out in full force, and the 5-star hotel ballroom was blindingly bright, filled with thundering applause. Seated at the head table, Greg, the marketing VP, was glowing. On the cover page of the presentation slides, Ben's name was squeezed into the absolute corner as a mere project execution team member, while Greg's name sat proudly at the top as general lead and strategic advisor. Every slide highlighting revenue growth only. Featured Greg's headshot, with no mention of the frontline execution team. The success of this account stems from the department's precise forecasting of market trends, as well as management's oversight and strategic guidance at critical junctures, Greg said smoothly, holding his wine glass. Facing compliments from the senior VP, he effortlessly channeled all the achievements into his own name with practiced ease. On stage, flowers were presented and honors were handed out. Company-wide commendations, massive performance bonuses, and the year's only VP-level promotion spot all went to Greg. He posed for official photos with the board members, grinning widely for the corporate newsletter cameras. Meanwhile, Ben, the man who had actually fought in the trenches and bled for 8 months, was assigned a seat at the back table near the exit and the restrooms. His name was never mentioned, and no one spared him a glance. A few former acquaintances shot him pitying looks, but none dared walk over to strike up a conversation. Watching the toast-making and backslapping on stage, he felt a cold chill run through his fingers. He folded his banquet program neatly and slipped it into his bag, leaving the event early before the dessert course arrived. Back then, Ben still possessed the raw idealism and stubbornness of a younger professional. He believed in fairness. He believed that hard work paid off. The next afternoon, he knocked on Greg's office door. Standing before the massive executive desk, Ben kept his tone as measured and calm as possible. He laid out the original charter and the team's sign-in sheets, asking for nothing more than basic accountability, the credit and recognition that he and his 2 interns had rightfully earned. Greg, I personally brought in the original client for this account, and my team pulled the all-nighters to build the core proposal. The current bonus distribution and commendation list just isn't fair to the people who actually did the work. Ben had assumed that even if upper management took the lion's share, they would at least have the decency to leave a few crumbs for the people below. He'd prepared a reasonable compromise proposal, requesting only a partial performance bonus and a brief department-wide acknowledgement of the execution team's labor. What he didn't realize was that his attempt to reason with Greg directly violated Greg's ultimate golden rule: authority is never to be challenged. Greg hadn't climbed from the bottom to a VP seat through actual business talent. He had done it through political maneuvering, leverage, and cronyism. He had run the marketing department as his personal fiefdom for so long that he was used to absolute deference from his subordinates. In his eyes, a junior manager coming in to demand fairness was an outright mutiny. To protect his authority and permanently eliminate Ben, a subordinate who was far too competent and refused to be a pawn, Greg decided to destroy him. A precise, cold-blooded frame-up was quietly orchestrated over the following 2 weeks. Greg controlled the department's expense approvals, project archives, and the highest administrative access to the ERP system. He instructed his trusted finance manager to systematically alter Ben's expense records and project logs over the past 8 months. The finance manager owed Greg a promotion 2 years prior, so he followed every order without hesitation, altering receipt dates and shifting expense line items to Ben's employee ID number. Inevitable email delays caused by international time zones during the project were blown out of proportion during weekly status meetings, framed by Greg as a severe lack of urgency that nearly cost us the client. Natural adjustments in the workflow caused by the vendor's unforeseen supply chain issues were twisted into Ben's negligence and poor judgment of commercial terms. Greg even circulated edited screenshots of internal team chats, cutting out his own late-night approvals to make it appear Ben had made unilateral risky decisions without consultation. The fatal blow came when Greg fabricated 2 complaint letters from third-party vendors, alongside a few falsified billing discrepancies, and pinned them squarely on Ben, implying that he had taken under-the-table kickbacks during commercial negotiations. The vendor signatures were forged digitally, a detail Ben would later spot while auditing the archive files. Within a single week, the narrative completely flipped. Through Greg's deliberate leaks and corporate whispering, the savior who had turned the company's finances around was recast in office gossip as a reckless, incompetent rogue who was lining his own pockets and had nearly cost the company millions. The disciplinary notice was swiftly posted on the company intranet. Following an internal review regarding marketing employee Ben's severe compliance infractions and major operational errors during the recent account execution, the committee has decided to relieve him of his core project responsibilities, downgrade his salary and title by 2 steps, revoke his annual performance bonus, disqualify him from all year-end awards, and reassign him to the marketing department's document archiving desk. A single memo, stamped with the corporate seal, coldly crushed Ben's 3 years of hard work and erased his visible future in an instant. HR called him into a closed-door meeting to deliver the news, refusing to let him submit any counter-evidence during the session. Those days were the darkest of Ben's life. Co-workers who used to be close with him and called him brother suddenly treated him like a pariah. If they crossed paths in the hallway, they would instantly stare down at their phones, terrified that being seen talking to him would offend Greg. The break room and the cubicle rows became hotbeds for mockery and snide remarks. One afternoon, Ben overheard 2 team leads chatting by the coffee machine. See? What good is being talented if you don't have corporate savvy? He actually tried to steal the VP's credit. He got exactly what he deserved. Everyone was convinced Ben was completely broken. By standard corporate rules, after suffering that kind of public humiliation, a young guy would usually hand in his resignation within 2 weeks and slink away quietly. Several former colleagues even privately texted him to offer referrals at rival firms, assuming he would jump ship at the earliest opportunity. Greg became insufferably arrogant. During subsequent department meetings, he would frequently use Ben as a subtle cautionary tale to keep everyone else in line. When they passed each other in the halls, Greg would look at him with pure condescension, utterly convinced this defeated kid would never pose a threat again. He even assigned Ben to handle all the most tedious, low-value filing work that no other staff member would touch, piling stacks of paper on his desk every single morning. But nobody knew that the moment Ben fell into that abyss and handed over his files, the last of his corporate naivety vanished. Standing by the shredder, watching his months of hard work sliced into confetti, he didn't cry and he didn't make a scene. Instead, he quietly initiated a long, cold, and meticulous Counter-strategy. Since this place didn't care about justice and only cared about compliance rules, he would use those exact same rules to bury the man who put him here. True power in the corporate arena is never about a desperate head-on collision. It is about keeping your head down, playing the long game, and riding the momentum when the right window opens. Ben understood the landscape perfectly. After the fallout 6 months ago, Greg held absolute power over the department, maintained deep executive connections, and ran the narrative internally. Ben had nothing, stuck at the very bottom of the corporate ladder. Any impulsive retaliation, even a split-second look of resentment in his eyes, would only trigger a swifter, more destructive crackdown from Greg. So he chose the smartest, most disciplined survival strategy available: total, unquestioned compliance. He stopped defending himself, stopped filing grievances, and stopped trying to claim his rightful credit in any public setting. Every morning at 8:30, he was the first to badge into the office, carrying a basic convenience store breakfast. He sat quietly at his desk in the corner, a cramped spot right next to the printer that the sun never reached. His daily routine became a blur of administrative grunt work, archiving documents, sorting receipts, and double-checking old ledger entries. During weekly status meetings, he kept his head down, took notes, and never tried to stand out, claim credit, speak up, or get entangled in internal politics. If Greg asked for a last-minute report before closing time, Ben would stay late without complaint, even if it meant missing his dinner. Faced with Greg's deliberate attempts to break him, Ben reacted like a pool of completely stagnant water. During one department-wide meeting, Greg tossed a massive spreadsheet, riddled with formatting errors that should have been handed to an intern, right onto Ben's desk. "Ben, I hear you've got some free time on your hands lately. Cross-reference the contact numbers for all our vendors over the past 3 years by hand, and get it to me before you log off today." The coworkers around him exchanged glances, some amused, others sympathetic. But Ben simply stood up, took the folder with both hands, and gave a slight nod. "Sure thing, Greg. I'll get right on it." He didn't even leave for lunch that day, grinding through the data straight into the night. When Greg left the building at 6 o'clock sharp, he glanced back at Ben's lit desk through the glass wall and smirked, satisfied that his intimidation tactics had fully worked. Everyone in the office assumed Ben had finally broken and accepted his fate. They figured Greg's corporate execution had completely shattered his spine. And Greg completely let his guard down. From behind the blinds of his executive office, Greg had watched Ben closely for 3 full months. Seeing the young man who once possessed a sharp edge and dared to confront him on the roof, now reduced to a timid, burnt-out office drone, Greg smiled with smug satisfaction. In his eyes, Ben had been broken. Just another piece of corporate machinery that posed absolutely no threat. However, once a manager's guard drops, greed tends to spiral completely out of control. With Ben no longer lingering as a potential whistleblower, and the department staffed entirely by loyalists bound by shared financial incentives, there was no one left who cared to, or had the leverage to, keep Greg in check. His actions grew increasingly reckless. The shady financial workarounds he used to mask in the ledgers were now handled carelessly. Project approvals, expense, reimbursements, outsourcing contracts, and vendor onboarding. The entire compliance infrastructure designed to mitigate risk became a joke within the marketing department, dictated entirely by the stroke of Greg's pen. He rarely reviewed attached supporting documents before signing off on multi-million-dollar spending requests, trusting his finance manager to cover all gaps. He began abusing his authority on a much larger scale, eventually treating the corporate public relations resources allocated from global headquarters as his personal slush fund. He charged family dinners, weekend resort trips, and luxury watch purchases to company expense accounts without hesitation. This was exactly the slow-acting poison Ben had been waiting for. Power can cover up the darkness for a while, but greed always leaves a trail. The more reckless Greg became, the more vulnerabilities he exposed. The more arrogant he acted, the bigger the loose ends he left behind. During the day, Ben was a ghost in the department, so low profile that even the cleaning staff pushed their carts right past him without noticing. But at night, Ben became a meticulous auditor, tracking a very messy paper trail. He possessed a structural advantage that no one else in the company, not even the CFO, had. He had personally executed the work, archived the history, and knew every single detail. Over the past 3 years, Ben had been deeply involved as a core contributor in nearly every major marketing project, from the initial contract draft and complex internal approvals to the actual line item expenses, final execution, and accounts receivable. More importantly, he had spent years maintaining a borderline compulsive habit of rigorous documentation. Screenshots of business communications, audio recordings of critical alignment calls, original contract drafts, bank wire receipts, and duplicate copies of every expense report were all backed up systematically by date, project, and category. Whenever a client sent him a formal email confirming payment terms, he saved a separate encrypted copy to his personal cloud storage, independent of the company server. Details that others forgot, he had mapped out flawlessly. Meeting minutes that others lost, he kept intact. The compliance shortcuts Greg took in the system, Ben saw clearly in his post-mortem reviews. From that moment on, Ben completely detached himself from personal pride, workplace grievances, and emotional bias. He transformed himself into a cold, purely rational processing unit, systematically tracing Greg's operational footprint over the last 3 years. No malice, no assumptions, no guesswork. He relied strictly on data, documentation, company policy, and corporate law. He even printed out copies of the company employee compliance handbook and federal commercial fraud statutes, marking relevant clauses with highlighters to cross-reference against each act of misconduct. He was never looking for a loud, emotional blowout to settle a personal score. He was orchestrating an airtight, fully compliant institutional reckoning, one that would dismantle Greg's career from the inside out, leaving him with absolutely no room to pivot. Over the next 3 months, Ben initiated a shadow audit that no one in the company saw coming. Every night after 10 p.m., the bustling office emptied out, plunging the entire high-rise into a dead silence. Only the low hum of the central AC kept him company as he sat beneath the single glow of his desk lamp. Some nights he worked until 1 or 2 in the morning, catching a quick nap on the office sofa before the rest of the team arrived at 8:30. Line-by-line verification, tier-by-tier deconstruction, and source-by-source tracing. Data, complex expense reports, and dense legalistic contract terms that would have put anyone else to sleep became clear lines of criminal evidence in Ben's eyes. Day after day, he immersed himself in the numbers, sharpening his focus. He created separate spreadsheets to tally total embezzled funds, calculating exact cumulative amounts stolen year over year, down to individual dollar values. The deeper he dug, the more he realized that the department's seemingly pristine facade was completely rotten at the foundation. Greg's self-dealing was no longer just a matter of skimming small amounts off the top. He had built a mature, comprehensive, and normalized black market operation. It was systemic corruption, embedded into every minor facet of the department's daily business. The most basic red flags were hidden in plain sight, right inside the routine travel and entertainment expenses. Ben used a highlighter to trace sharp neon lines across the printed ledgers. Massive amounts of business entertainment and out-of-town travel vouchers contained shockingly sloppy discrepancies. On more than one occasion, Greg had filed reimbursement claims for receipts from 3 different cities on the very same day. Countless high-end club and entertainment invoices worth tens of thousands of dollars, stamped late at night, carried lazy generic justifications like client relationship management. There were even stacks of sequential receipts from shell companies that had already been flagged and dissolved by the tax authorities. The timing, locations, scenarios, and actual business needs conflicted at every turn. The vulnerabilities were everywhere, but Greg had spent years using his primary approval authority to treat the company treasury like a personal ATM. The real bleeding, however, came from fictitious outsourcing contracts. Ben looked past the surface of several digital marketing strategic consulting agreements signed by Greg. He discovered that Greg had quietly used his immediate in-laws to set up multiple shell companies in low-tax jurisdictions. entities with no staff, no physical offices, and zero actual operational capabilities. He searched state business registration databases in his spare time during lunch breaks to confirm the family ownership ties, saving official public records as supplementary evidence. These shell companies didn't even have a functioning website, yet they held long-term, high-value contracts with the marketing department for brand management, digital promotion, and event planning. Once corporate routing sent the heavy wire transfers to these accounts, the shell entities would deduct a minimal tax withholding. The remaining millions were shuffled through a complex web of personal accounts, eventually landing safely in Greg's private trust and offshore bank accounts. It was a blatant embezzlement of corporate assets that had gone completely unchecked for years. Beyond that, vendor kickbacks and pay-to-play schemes had become an open secret within the department. The industry's actual premium vendors, those with competitive, transparent pricing, had to play by Greg's rules and budget for a fixed percentage kickback. If they didn't, no matter how many years they had partnered with the company, how cost-effective they were, or how flawless their delivery was, Greg would abruptly terminate the contract during the next bidding cycle, citing failure to meet vendor qualifications. He would then immediately replace them with overpriced, low-quality vendors who belonged to his personal network but knew how the game was played. One long-term supplier had privately confided in Ben last year about the mandatory kickback demands. Unaware, Ben was already documenting every word of their conversation. Countless premium industry partnerships were systematically sabotaged, and the company's bottom line suffered continuously, all to feed Greg's bottomless personal greed. What was most cynical, however, was how Greg managed the fallout. Every deficit, loss, and accounting discrepancy caused by his skimming was meticulously repackaged through creative accounting and distributed back into the project budgets of the frontline team. He made the ordinary employees doing the actual heavy lifting pay for his greed. Over the past 2 years, dozens of junior staff members had silently absorbed bad performance reviews, lost bonuses, or even been managed out of the company because their projects were over budget or failed to meet margin targets. They never knew that the root cause of their failure was executive corruption at the top. Confronted with the staggering scope of the fraud, Ben sat in the dark, his eyes completely calm, untouched by emotion. He didn't write a single word of subjective accusation, added no moral commentary, and steered clear of malicious speculation. He relied strictly on objective facts to build an airtight chain of custody. Throughout the 127-page report, every single anomalous transaction was precisely cross-referenced with timestamps, contract IDs, bank wire reference numbers, invoice codes, and the internal emails that served as corroborating evidence. Every policy infraction was directly mapped against corporate compliance boundaries, tax regulations, and the current federal statutes on corporate fraud. Attached to the end of the document was an organized appendix folder containing hundreds of scanned exhibits, audio transcriptions, and public registration filings. Every piece of evidence intersected, locking together flawlessly. 3 months of grinding in the dark had yielded the heavy stack of documents on his desk. The prose was cold, the narrative strictly factual. There wasn't a single complaint about Greg in the entire file, nor a single attempt to smear his character. Yet every printed line of text was a definitive clinical strike, more than enough to dismantle Greg's 5-year power structure and hand him a federal indictment. The evidence was airtight. The timing was perfect. Ben didn't hesitate for a second, nor did he linger to watch the fallout. He knew all too well that in a high-stakes corporate environment, the dumbest thing you can do is take your evidence to the counterparty for a private showdown, an extortion attempt, or a public confrontation. That would only give them a chance to destroy files, flip the narrative, and put you in a dangerous, legally vulnerable position. Greg had once bragged to his inner circle that he could bury any disgruntled employee who tried to confront him one-on-one. Real accountability is never a sloppy corporate shouting match. It is a swift, legitimate, and fully compliant strike. It was Friday at 12:15 p.m., and the office was completely deserted for lunch. Every staff member had left for the cafeteria or nearby restaurants, leaving only empty cubicles stretching across the open floor. Ben sat calmly at his desk, his right index finger hovering steadily over the left mouse button. On his screen, the encrypted file, containing the 127-page report, hundreds of exhibits, dozens of audio logs, and fully traced bank transactions, had finished uploading. He double-checked all recipient addresses one final time to eliminate typos. His expression didn't change as his finger tapped down. Sent, utilizing the company's official corporate whistleblower hotline via a direct secure link to global headquarters, alongside a multi-encrypted anonymous email account registered under an unrelated pseudonym. The unassailable file was dispatched simultaneously to 4 core channels: the chairman of the board, the head of global internal audit, the chief compliance officer, and the corporate ethics committee. The whistleblower portal guaranteed complete identity protection for submitters, eliminating any risk of internal retaliation. Furthermore, to ensure that no internal allies of Greg could sweep the report under the rug or bury the investigation, Ben had taken a parallel step. Through official regulatory channels, he simultaneously filed formal, verified reports containing the evidence of tax evasion and corporate embezzlement with the Internal Revenue Service and the local white-collar crime division. He attached signed sworn statements confirming all evidence was collected legally through authorized job duties. The entire process was executed with textbook precision. The data sources were legally obtained, and the reporting channels were completely beyond reproach. Ben had thoroughly insulated himself from any liability regarding malicious reporting or unfair competition. He hadn't leaked anything to the public, nor had he tried to rally internal employees or weaponize office gossip. He simply handed the rules over to the system and the truth over to the law. Then he shut down his computer just like any other day, picked up his lunchbox, and walked down to the cafeteria. He bought a simple sandwich and sat alone at a far table, eating slowly without glancing at his phone, giving no hint of the storm he'd just set in motion. The storm hit with blinding speed, completely blindsiding the local office. That same afternoon at 2:40 p.m., 3 black SUVs carrying plates from corporate headquarters pulled up directly in front of the building. Without any advance warning, the company's highest-ranking internal investigation unit and a team of external forensic accountants embedded themselves into the branch office. Security was ordered to block all department exits to prevent anyone from removing confidential paperwork. The minute they stepped out of the vehicles, they presented a signed, red-stamped mandate from the chairman. They immediately mobilized building security to completely lock down the marketing department's historical books, original contracts, and the physical archive room. Within 30 seconds, Greg's administrative and approval access to the ERP system was permanently frozen from the back end. All his digital signature permissions for financial disbursements were revoked instantly. The forensic audit was underway. When the rumors finally reached Greg, he was lounging at the Starbucks downstairs from the office. His legs were crossed as he casually discussed next quarter's brand development budget with the owner of a newly formed vendor agency, one of his brother-in-law's shell company subsidiaries. He looked completely relaxed and full of confidence, already planning a weekend golf trip out of town. When his executive assistant ran in, pale-faced, to whisper the news in his ear, Greg actually scoffed, taking an unbothered sip of his coffee. "Corporate audit? You're panicking over nothing," Greg said, lighting a cigarette with a dismissive shrug. Over the past 5 years, he had survived dozens of internal reviews and routine spot checks. Every single time, he had used his political connections to get a heads up before the auditors arrived, cleaned up the ledgers through creative accounting, greased the right wheels, and buried the issue with ease. In his mind, corporate life was just a web of personal favors. As long as you had deep roots and executive coverage at the top, there was absolutely nothing you couldn't handle within your own territory. He quickly put out his cigarette, hurried back up to his office, and calmly began working his phone, checking in with internal contacts to see which way the wind was blowing and trying to get people to pull strings for him. At the same time, he fired off a text to his finance manager, hinting that they needed to immediately scrub the trail on the North Mountain project, destroy physical receipts, and alter digital transaction logs. But this time, every single call he placed went straight to voicemail, or ended with his contacts giving vague, panicked excuses, before abruptly hanging up to distance themselves. Senior executives who'd once accepted his dinner invitations refused to respond to his texts entirely. Every single trick in his playbook had completely failed. Past audits had been high-level, superficial spot checks. As long as Greg kept the presentation clean, the auditors lacked a precise entry point and eventually went home empty-handed. But this time, the internal investigation team was sitting in the conference room with something different. A navigational roadmap that was far more precise and professional than anything Greg's own team could have assembled. The 127-page report lay wide open right in front of the managing director of internal audit. Every anomalous transaction, every bank wire trace, and every ultimate beneficiary of the shell companies had been flagged in red by Ben. The dates, dollar amounts, handling employees, and approval chains were laid out like a massive, undeniable net. The forensic accountants cross-referenced Ben's data with the company's central financial database, confirming every single irregularity within 2 hours. Greg, save yourself the trouble of calling in favors. On Monday afternoon, the managing director of internal audit walked straight into Greg's office, flanked by 2 stone-faced corporate attorneys. They carried sealed boxes of copied bank records and vendor contracts seized from the archive storage. You are accused of abusing your corporate authority to embezzle and misappropriate approximately $24 million in company funds through 3 related entities, including Nexus Tech. The parent company has already filed a formal criminal complaint with law enforcement, and we need you to cooperate with the investigation. The color instantly drained from Greg's face. He instinctively tried to stand up to defend himself. This is a smear campaign. Those are legitimate external vendor contracts. The entire workflow went through standard compliance. Compliance? The attorney slammed a stack of audited bank records and offshore wire transfers belonging to Greg's brother-in-law onto the executive desk, his tone ice cold. This account belongs to your immediate family, and every single dollar came directly from our corporate treasury. Don't waste your time fighting this, Greg. We've already mapped this against the criminal statutes. This is more than enough for a 10-year sentence. Staring at the familiar ledger printouts, documents he thought would never see the light of day, Greg visibly shuddered, slumping into his executive leather chair like a hollow shell. He reached for his desk drawer where he kept a bottle of whiskey, only to find the cabinet had already been locked by security during the audit lockdown. Connections can cover up intent, and executive power can suppress internal gossip, but cold data doesn't lie, and the law doesn't negotiate. It took exactly 3 days. The illusion of power, the prestigious title, and the unassailable network that Greg had meticulously built over 5 years crumbled to pieces, dismantled entirely by the silent blade Ben had slipped into the system. Wednesday at 9 a.m. was usually the time when every department held their mandatory weekly status meetings. Instead, the open plan layout of the marketing department was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Across hundreds of cubicles, nobody was actually getting any work done. Their fingers tapped mechanically on their keyboards, but their eyes were glued to the bottom right corner of their monitors, waiting for the company-wide announcement. Ding. The corporate internet notification chimed in unison across hundreds of computers, and a pop-up window appeared carrying a high-priority, urgent red flag. It was a company-wide termination notice, and it pulled no punches. Following a joint investigation by the board of directors, internal audit, and corporate compliance, it has been verified that branch marketing VP Greg has severely violated corporate compliance boundaries. He is suspected of leveraging his executive position to commit large-scale embezzlement and facilitate illegal kickbacks. Effective immediately, corporate has stripped Greg of all administrative and operational responsibilities, placing him on suspension pending a full investigation. All salary, stock options, outstanding performance bonuses, and dividends under his name have been frozen indefinitely, and his system access has been terminated. The company has initiated legal proceedings and formally turned this case over to law enforcement. Corporate maintains a zero-tolerance policy for white-collar crime and will not pursue a private settlement under any circumstances. This official memo, bearing the executive electronic seal from global headquarters, definitively signed the death warrant on Greg's corporate empire. HR simultaneously locked his company email, badge access, and building entry permissions. However, the velocity of the storm far exceeded what the average employee had anticipated. The filings Ben had quietly initiated with tax authorities, and the white-collar crime division months ago, acted like a pair of massive iron jaws, clamping down tight just 2 hours after the internal memo hit. Around 11 a.m., 2 IRS criminal investigation vehicles and a police cruiser pulled up directly in front of the building entrance. The tax agents walked a formal audit demand straight to the CFO's desk, requiring the immediate surrender of every travel and entertainment receipt Greg had processed over the past 5 years. Meanwhile, detectives from the white-collar crime division, having officially locked down the 127 pages of airtight evidence Ben provided, moved rapidly to freeze Greg's real estate assets, luxury vehicles, and bank accounts under a judicial order. Search warrants were issued for his personal residence and private safety deposit boxes. The corporate world is often far more cold-blooded than any script. The moment power vanishes, human opportunism exposes itself without a shred of dignity. The handful of team leads who used to trail behind Greg, living off the crumbs of his corporate self-dealing, turned pale with fear. They practically trampled each other running into the conference room to cooperate with the internal audit team, desperate to distance themselves from him, volunteering every small detail they could. Recall about Greg's shady vendor dealings. The external vendors who had been calling Greg brother over expensive dinners blacklisted his number overnight, terrified of being dragged into a federal corporate fraud case and losing all company contracts permanently. The executive who had been running the show just days ago became a corporate leper within 24 hours. HR circulated an internal memo banning all staff from communicating with Greg on company devices. By Thursday afternoon, the office professionals in the high-rise began heading downstairs for lunch, leaving a massive section of the department empty and quiet. Ben didn't go to the cafeteria. He sat quietly at his low-profile corner desk by the window, methodically binding a stack of old files with clips, preparing them for the shredder. He'd finished delivering the official archive documents to the audit team that morning, answering all their routine questions calmly, without volunteering any extra information about Greg's misconduct. Suddenly, a loud commotion of shouting and shoving broke out from the far end of the hallway. "Greg, you can't go in there. Your badge has already been deactivated in the system." The receptionist's frantic voice echoed down the hall. She'd tried to block the glass entry doors, but Greg had forced his way past her. "Get out of my way." A hoarse, hysterical roar cut through the air, and the glass doors to the office were violently kicked open. Greg stumbled into the marketing floor looking completely unhinged. He clearly hadn't slept in days. He had lost a noticeable amount of weight. His eyes were bloodshot, and his usually perfectly styled hair was matted across his forehead. His custom suit was covered in dirt stains, his tie was crooked, and he radiated a tense, frantic aura of a massive hangover. He'd rushed over from the lawyer's office downtown, abandoning his vehicle in a no-parking zone out of desperation. The few dozen employees who hadn't left for lunch stood up in shock, instinctively backing away, forming a wide, empty circle around him. Everyone pulled out their phones discreetly to record the scene, afraid to step forward or intervene. Greg didn't care about the eyes on him. His gaze swept wildly across the open floor before locking dead onto Ben, who was sitting by the window, watching him calmly. Greg's breathing grew ragged as he stumbled through the rows of cubicles, knocking over a recycling bin full of scrap paper along the way. Loose documents scattered across the carpet, but he paid no attention. Thud. Right there, in front of dozens of stunned, disbelief-filled onlookers, the man who had once ruled the branch office like a personal fiefdom fell heavily to his knees on the gray carpet right in front of Ben's desk. The heavy impact made a couple of female employees down the row gasp, covering their mouths. "Ben, please, man, just give me a break. Let me off the hook just this once." Greg clawed at the edge of Ben's cubicle partition, his knuckles turning white from the strain. He begged without a shred of dignity, tears and sweat blurring his face as his body shook uncontrollably. "I know it was you. That report. Nobody else in this entire department could have unraveled those transactions so cleanly. It's all on me, okay? I screwed up 6 months ago. I shouldn't have stolen credit for the tech account. I shouldn't have demoted you to archives. Look, I'm literally on my knees apologizing to you, all right?" Greg rambled incoherently, suddenly raising his right hand and slapping himself hard across the face. Slap, slap, slap. The sharp, heavy cracks echoed brutally through the dead-silent office. Within a few hits, his face began to swell, red marks blooming across his cheekbones. "Just leave me a way out. I'll wire you whatever cash I can move from my offshore accounts. 5 million. If that's not enough, I'll sign over the title to my luxury sports car and my vacation condo. Just go to law enforcement and internal audit right now and tell them there was a mistake when you were archiving the historical files. Tell them it was just an accounting error, not embezzlement. I have a 70-year-old mother at home, and my kid starts elementary school next month. I can't go to federal prison then." Watching the man groveling on the floor, throwing his dignity completely into the dirt, Ben finally set down the folder he was holding. The midday sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, hitting Ben's back and leaving his face partially in shadow. From beginning to end, his expression remained as still as a deep, windless well. There was no anger, no vindication, not even a smirk of smug satisfaction. He didn't do what weak people do when they finally win. He didn't launch into a furious tirade asking Greg why he had been so cruel 6 months ago. He didn't vent the months of frustration and humiliation he had swallowed. He just looked at Greg silently, as if he were looking at a piece of corporate waste waiting to be cleared out. The utter detachment in his eyes drove Greg into a deeper panic than any vicious insult ever could. "Greg," Ben finally spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it was crisp, measured, and carried clearly to every single person listening in. 6 months ago, on a Thursday around this exact time, I stood in the executive office at the top of this building. I brought you the original charter for the tech account because I wanted basic accountability." Greg's sobbing cut off instantly. He stared up at him, blank-faced. Ben leaned forward slightly, his dark, unfathomable eyes locking onto Greg's dilated, terrified pupils. He spoke deliberately, drawing out every word. "You sat in your executive chair that day and didn't even bother to look up at me. You told me that in this department, whatever your pen signs is accountability. Since you like leveraging the rules so much, I'm giving that line right back to you today. In front of forensic data and federal law, they are accountability." Greg visibly recoiled, as if struck by an invisible hammer. The last of his hope shattered, and his posture collapsed completely onto the carpet, shoulders heaving with quiet sobs. Click, click, click. Right then, the steady, rhythmic sound of dress shoes echoed down the bright hallway. 2 federal agents in dark suits, carrying white-collar crime badges pinned to their jackets, walked through the glass doors with serious expressions. The lead agent turned down the aisle, offering a brief nod to Ben as he passed, a silent acknowledgement of a whistleblower who had delivered a flawless chain of custody and cooperated perfectly with a regulatory investigation. The agents had reviewed Ben's submitted evidence weeks prior and confirmed its full validity. The 2 agents stepped up, flanking Greg on the floor. "Greg, local white-collar crime division. You are under arrest for grand larceny and corporate embezzlement. This is a warrant for your arrest. Please come with us." The heavy silver handcuffs glinted sharply under the fluorescent lights. With a cold click, they locked around the wrists that had spent 5 years holding absolute authority, greed, and an executive signing pen. Greg didn't resist. He didn't have the energy left to try. He looked like a hollowed-out shell as he was led out through the glass doors under the dead silence of hundreds of his former employees. No one stepped forward to comfort him or plead on his behalf. Ben never looked up to watch his departure, not even when the elevator doors at the end of the hall finally slid shut. The afternoon sun remained intense. Outside the glass facade, the traffic of the CBD hummed along, moving perfectly on its designated tracks. Ben turned back around calmly and fed the last batch of outdated files into the shredder. As the machine emitted its steady grinding hum, the 6 months of blacklisting and isolation, along with the very name Greg, were turned into irreversible confetti. Ben sat back down, woke up his monitor, and on the blank landing page of a new document, typed out the name of his next project. He'd already received a preliminary email from the board, asking him to lead the company's new national expansion initiative once the audit concluded. From start to finish, this 6-month campaign had involved no screaming matches, no public scenes, and no mutual destruction. He had simply sat in the dark, held his edge, and let the architecture of compliance and the law do the heavy lifting. It was the victory of a truly disciplined professional, the cleanest, most absolute corporate reckoning possible, leaving the opposition with nowhere left to run. 3 months later, the gavel fell, bringing the long, drawn-out corporate storm to a definitive end. A final judicial bulletin was pinned to the top of the corporate intranet. Greg had been convicted of corporate embezzlement, commercial bribery, and tax evasion. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, accompanied by complete asset forfeiture and massive fines. His appeal was rejected by the district court within weeks, with judges citing the overwhelming volume of irrefutable documentary evidence provided by the corporate whistleblower. Attached just below the bulletin was a lifetime industry ban issued by the Regulatory Association. That same profile photo of him in a tailored suit, once displayed proudly at industry summits, was now plastered under a bold font blacklist. Over the years, his illicit gains, embezzled corporate funds, and vendor kickbacks had been aggressively clawed back by a joint task force of the IRS and the courts, seized down to the last penny. All his luxury vehicles, vacation properties, and offshore investment accounts were liquidated to repay the company's losses. The impenetrable network, prestigious title, millions in wealth, and the untouchable career he had spent 5 years building were wiped out overnight. Falling right alongside Greg was his entrenched web of cronies. The finance manager, who had aided in doctoring the ledgers, was fired and handed over to law enforcement, receiving a 2-year suspended sentence for conspiracy. The inner circle team leads who used to mock Ben in meetings were completely uprooted by internal audit, demoted, reassigned to remote regional branches, or outright terminated for failing to report known financial misconduct. All vendor partnerships linked to Greg's shell companies were permanently terminated, with legal claims filed to recover overpaid contract fees. Meanwhile, after concluding a comprehensive 5-year audit of the marketing department's books, the corporate task force finally cleared the air on everything that had happened 6 months ago. In an unprecedented move, an official exoneration memo signed by the chairman himself was blasted to every employee's inbox. The board held an all-staff virtual town hall to formally apologize to Ben for the unfair disciplinary action and wrongful professional damage he'd endured. Every fabricated disciplinary action was voided. The severe compliance infraction on Ben's HR record was permanently expunged. His salary and title were fully restored, and the performance bonuses and year-end dividends unjustly withheld over the past 6 months were wired to his account on Friday afternoon via a fast-tracked payroll approval, with additional interest compensation added for the delayed payment. But that wasn't the end of it. The executive board didn't just commend Ben in the memo for his integrity, his respect for the rules, and his willingness to protect the company's core interests under immense pressure. Corporate HR issued a direct transfer order. Ben is hereby exceptionally promoted to Senior Project Director of the branch office. His administrative rank is elevated to Executive Band 10, granting him dual authority to oversee core new business development and initial compliance reviews. A 26-year-old senior director, it shattered the fastest promotion record in the company's 20-year history. He was given a private corner executive office with full independent budget approval rights, a dedicated personal assistant, and a direct reporting line to the group CEO. With the storm finally over, the entire marketing department fell dead silent. When Ben walked onto the floor on Monday morning, the air seemed to instantly freeze. The coworkers who had previously dismissed him, isolated him, and mocked him in the break room for being clueless and deserving of grunt work, now stood up awkwardly from their desks. They leaned forward slightly, their eyes carrying a mix of survivor's guilt, poorly concealed flattery, and genuine, deep-seated fear. Everyone adjusted their work priorities to prioritize any task Ben assigned, rushing to complete requests before deadlines without delay. The new hire, a junior guy who had once brazenly dumped scrap paper on Ben's desk to shred, was now standing by the door of Ben's new office, completely pale. He was holding a freshly brewed cup of hot coffee, his hands shaking so much the cup rattled against the saucer. Ben. Sir, your office is all cleaned up. Here is the latest status report for the East Coast accounts. Ben glanced at him, his expression as mild as it had always been. He took the coffee with both hands, and even offered a polite, "Thanks, I appreciate it." Looking like he had just been spared a death sentence, the junior employee backed out of the office, nodding profusely. It was only at this moment that these seasoned corporate opportunists truly understood the scope of the 6-month campaign. The young man who had stayed silent, endured the freeze-out, and accepted every slight without complaint, was never a helpless victim. On the contrary, while everyone else was blinded by emotion or short-term gains, he had maintained absolute cold-blooded clarity, quietly closing the loop on an airtight compliance audit. The floor was finally reminded of a long-forgotten corporate truth. Those who crush others with temporary authority will inevitably fall when that authority shifts. The only true leverage that guarantees longevity isn't fleeting connections or dirty tricks. It's an absolute reverence for corporate policy and the boundaries of the law. At 11 p.m., the bustling office building once again returned to a dead silence. Inside the new executive office, the massive floor-to-ceiling windows were spotless. A night breeze slipped through a slightly open pane, washing away the stale air left behind from a day packed with back-to-back client strategy meetings and internal compliance briefings Ben had led for department staff. Ben stood alone by the window. His mood was remarkably steady. There was no euphoric thrill of revenge, no condescending superiority, and none of the arrogance typical of a young professional thrust into sudden power. From the very beginning, his goal was never to settle a personal vendetta against Greg. He had simply executed the most instinctual risk hedging available to a professional when trapped in a severely compromised environment. He didn't crave the satisfaction of crushing a rival. He just held on to his professional baseline in a swamp where everyone else had chosen to sink into complicity and silence. In high-stakes adult maneuvers, the most useless retaliation is sinking into emotional brawls and becoming just as rabid as your attacker. The most dignified resolution is to strip away all personal grievances and let the self-correcting mechanisms of policy and law handle the verdict. Tactics and ego are ultimately fragile against rigid rules. The arrogance and shady dealings hidden in the dark were doomed the moment the organization decided to launch a legitimate audit. The commercial world operates on fundamental mechanics. As long as the gears of compliance keep turning, every debt incurred past the red line will eventually be called in. Ben pulled his gaze back from the skyline and switched off the last light in the office. In the dark, he strode out the door. The office behind him settled into absolute silence, while the long corridor ahead was clear, bright, and wide open.